I'm Christopher Lydon, and this is Open Source at sea this time on our own Odyssey, a voyage between the ancient epic that refuses to die and Christopher Nolan's blockbuster movie version for us in this summer of 2026. It's the story, of course, we all half know about the wily old Greek warrior king coming home 10 years late from a horrible war against Troy, maybe 1200 BC. Nobody knows the grip of it all better than our guest, Daniel Mendelsohn. You sailed the route Odysseus took, Daniel, with your 81-year-old father and made an intimate mission of family discovery in it. You've published your own translation of Homer's whole poem, and now you're reviewing this summer's big movie for the New York Review. Do you feel haunted by this Odysseus? Do you see him in your dreams?
Well, he's been with me for a very long time, Chris. You know, I studied classics as an undergraduate at the University of Virginia almost 50 years ago. I first read the Odyssey back then. I learned Greek at the hands of a great Odyssey scholar, Jenny Strauss-Clay. So I've been sort of dealing with the Odyssey my entire adult life. And then, of course, more seriously in past years when I was working on my translation, writing very often about the Odyssey. And as you mentioned, in my book, An Odyssey, A Father, a Son, and an Epic, I talked about this remarkable experience I had actually on a cruise with my late father, retracing the footsteps of Odysseus. So I do feel like Odysseus and the Odyssey have been very much entwined with basically my entire adult life, I would say.
It sounds that way. I must say, I read lots of the Iliad at the Roxbury Latin School a million years ago in Boston, but I've somehow left him more than you have. Who is Matt Damon's Odysseus? And what does he add to the legend?
It's an interesting question, Chris. We're talking simultaneously now. Everyone in the world, it seems, is talking about the Nolan movie, whether it's Chris Nolan's Odysseus or Matt Damon's Odysseus. I think, to my mind, you know, the major tweaks that Nolan has done in his movie is to completely refashion the character of Odysseus. So if you read the Odyssey in any translation, his primary characteristic is his wiliness, his wit, his intelligence, his cunning. The adjective that is most often used of him means the man of great cunning. And the Odyssey is filled with scenes that are meant to showcase this extraordinary sort of intellectual power. You know, Odysseus is an interesting hero because he is not just a huge lunk who can run fast and kill a lot of guys. You know, that's the territory of the Iliad. So what I thought was so interesting in Nolan's version is that he completely refashions the character of Odysseus, essentially cuts virtually every scene in the original text that showcases Odysseus's wiliness and cleverness and turns him instead into a sort of anguished, guilt-haunted. It's funny, he's more like Aeneas, actually, than Odysseus. He's more like the Aeneas of the Aeneid than he is like the Odyssey of the Odyssey. You know, the main point of the film is that he feels this now terrible guilt for having, you know, created, so to speak, this weapon of mass destruction, the Trojan horse, which allowed the Greeks to finally sack the city of Troy after 10 years and unleash this unbelievably violent destruction of the city. So I regretted it, not because I'm, you know, a classicist who's gatekeeping the Odyssey, but I also felt it didn't give Matt Damon, I think, much to work with. I admire Matt Damon very much as an actor, and I've always thought he particularly enjoys roles that allow him not to be just the adorable leading man, but clever, repressed, you know, the talented Mr. Ripley. I think he enjoys having something to work with that lets him be sly and a little bit unseemly in a way. I remember the first time I ever saw him in a movie, it was in an Iraq War movie where he plays a drug-addicted veteran, a very young Matt Damon. And I thought this sort of unrelentingly dour, grumpy, guilt-haunted Odysseus did not really give Damon a lot of material to work with. basically.
Yeah.
I didn't think it showcased what makes him interesting as an actor, aside from totally changing the character of Odysseus.
I noted that there was no great speech from Odysseus in Matt Damon's voice. There's nothing that says, oh, by the way, here's what it's like inside me.
Yeah.
We never get the Matt Damon take exactly. My slightly odd take on the whole movie is that it's an anti-war movie. Mm-hmm. First of all, Christopher Nolan has made it for us moderns, and part of the context in which we see it is the background of horrific warfare in Gaza, in Ukraine, who knows about Iran one day to another. But early in the Nolan film, Odysseus' wife, Penelope, is overhearing war plans, and she says angrily, "This is monstrous." Short sentence. And the word stuck with me. We're talking, I think, about 2 essays on monstrosity. In the movie, surely, and in Homer's epic, too. Both monstrosity in the war madness, in our human DNA, but also in our culture back thousands of years. Brutal, organized killing for its own sake at a terrific price. And scene after scene, I was saying to myself in the movie, saw it twice, this is insane. And I could feel Christopher Nolan sort of acknowledging that that's what the movie is about. The other part of the story is you can also feel a peace project unfolding at the heart of the Odyssey story around the drive to find some safe route home. Out of the war, out of the madness, and it's more urgent today than ever because it's not just our sanity that's at stake, it's our survival.
I do think you're right. Look, Chris Nolan, I think, is a very interesting filmmaker. When I heard he was doing the Odyssey, I was quite excited, actually, because I think his sort of narrative technique, the way he likes to move back and forth in time and weave together multiple plot lines is very Homeric, actually. And there's no question, and I think he's even spoken about this, that he has sort of refashioned the Odyssey to address, contemporary concerns. As a classicist, I can tell you that this whole idea about feeling guilty about the Trojan War is wholly foreign to Homer. It's not something you'll ever find in Homer. The society that Homer depicts in both the Iliad and the Odyssey, is a warrior culture. These guys go to war not because they have an ideological beef. In fact, there's a very amusing moment, well, not so amusing actually, in the Iliad where Achilles says, I have no problem with the Trojans. I'm not here because I hate the Trojans. They go to show how great they are as warriors. They don't feel regret about sacking cities and all the terrible thing that goes with it. So clearly Nolan has, let us say, repurposed, I would say, the outlines of Odysseus' story and filled it with a message which is very foreign to Homer. Now, there's 2 ways to view this movie. You can review it as an adaptation of Homer, in which case I think it fails because it completely changes everything, the character of the protagonist, the meaning of the episodes. As an analogy, I have said a number of times by now, if you were to make a 150 million blockbuster version of Moby Dick, in which Ahab was an adorable old codger whom the crew adores and suddenly has terrible, anguished moral qualms about the whaling industry, would you say it's an adaptation of Moby Dick or just something totally different? And that's basically what Nolan has done. On the other hand, you can view it and evaluate it as a Christopher Nolan film and forget about Homer, in which case I think it works. Again, if you forget about Homer, and it's very much of a piece with what Nolan has been doing for a very long time, particularly in Oppenheimer and Batman, which is to explore, what it means to have unleashed violence of a certain kind on the world and what that does to your conscience. That's certainly the point of Oppenheimer. And I have seen reviews of Nolan, which I think very cleverly point out that in a lot of ways, Nolan's Odyssey is basically a sequel to Oppenheimer.
Yes, I think that's plausible. Christopher Nolan is getting a lot of praise for this Odyssey, but I wonder if the reviews are taking him seriously enough. I think Christopher Nolan of the Odyssey comes straight out of William James's rage and despair from 1910 in that essay that I loved, The Moral Equivalent of War. But World War I is approaching, and James is writing, modern man inherits all the pugnacity and all the love of glory of his ancestors, And to show war's irrationality and horror has no effect on him. The horrors make the fascination. But here William James turns to Homer. He says, history is a bath of blood. The Iliad, preceding the Odyssey, is one long recital of how Diomedes and Ajax, Sarpedon and Hector killed. No detail of the wounds they made is spared us, and the Greek mind fed upon that story. Greek history, says William James, is a panorama of jingoism and imperialism, war for war's sake, all the citizens being warriors. It is horrible reading because of the irrationality of it all, save for the purpose of making history, so-called, and the history is that of the utter ruin of a civilization which in intellectual respects was perhaps the highest the earth has ever seen. I think a lot of that is in the back of Christopher Nolan's mind.
It dovetails, Chris, with what I was saying before, which is that the Greeks' attitude toward war and violence was quite different to ours.
Yep.
And particularly in the Iliad, as I mentioned, these guys glory in being able to inflict these terrible kinds of violence on their enemy. They enjoy a good kill. Homer loves to describe an inventive, battlefield death, spearing someone through the mouth and hooking them out of their chariots the way you would hook a fish when you were angling is one memorable simile. So they admired martial violence and admired someone who did it in an inventive and interesting way. I will say, though, it's worth thinking about, Chris. I think that the Odyssey, let us remember, is a post-war text. It is about what happens after the war. And I do think one of the reasons, because hovering over our conversation is the great question, why do we care about this text 3,000 years later? And there is something, it strikes me as I get older in particular, that the image of Odysseus, a lone figure, one of the interesting things about the Odyssey is the gods are largely absent compared to the Iliad. In the Iliad, they're all over the place. They're on the battlefield. They're fighting besides their favorite mortals. They're hooking up on Mount Olympus. They're all over the place. In the Odyssey, the gods have largely receded. Athena gets involved, but not much more than that. And so there's a figure of a lone person trying to make his way through a scary, unknown landscape where the old rules don't apply anymore, and trying to find a way to go home in a world that is unknowable and unimaginable is a very modern kind of figure. This is like the modernist novel takes that character and turns him into the protagonist of, everything from Ulysses to Kafka to, everybody else. And in that respect, I think the Odyssey speaks to us, I dare say, more right now than the Iliad does. Odysseus is a character we feel we know. To return to your point about how this film seems to be very preoccupied with contemporary political concerns, I think this is a text that is about how to make sense of a world where the rules seem to have fallen away. Nobody knows how to act anymore. And for that reason, I think it always feels fresh to us, always feels contemporary somehow, in a way that I don't think the Iliad does. I say that as someone who loves the Iliad and teaches it, and certainly what it has to say about mortality and the value of life are very important. But the Odyssey always feels modern in a way I think the Iliad doesn't necessarily.
Yeah, I wanted to affirm your point that the recklessness and the joy, in a certain way, in the ancient Greek celebration of war is remarkable. Funny part with Nolan is that he loves photographing it, the blood and guts, the destruction, the clanging of shields and swords, and the sheer noise of the thing. But this is different. In the Nolan script, Ulysses is well aware of the ironies here and of his own responsibility, indeed his guilt. But I think Nolan is telling us that it's that recklessness that is the problem in our world, maybe even in the literature.
Yeah.
When Ulysses is reunited finally with his wife Penelope, he makes a confession. He says, among other things, to burn the walls of Troy And that's what he just did with his Trojan horse and his men. To burn the walls of Troy was to burn the world entire. In other words, this is not an isolated event, either in history or in literature. Is that what Nolan's saying?
One of the interesting elements that he pulls out of Homer is, what some scholars, including Bernard Knox, whom you and I discussed recently, the great classicist Bernard Knox, has said in his introduction to the Robert Fagel's translation of the Odyssey, I believe it was, that there was one social and religious custom in archaic Greece that more than anything else resembled what we would think of as a universal law. And this was this institution that we call xenia, which is the rules of hospitality, the way that you must welcome a stranger who appears on your doorstep into your house, give them hospitality, feed them, clothe them, and you then would expect the same to happen to you when you showed up on someone else's.
Yeah, I like that notion, all on the suspicion that the stranger might just be a god.
And one of the reasons you do that is because, as we know from Greek and Roman mythology, this, the beggar who shows up on your doorstep may be a god in disguise testing your hospitality. So always better to err on the side of niceness. And Nolan understands the importance of that in his movie. It's one of the things I admired about the movie. He doesn't, of course, use the Greek word, which would just be confusing. He calls it Zeus's law. He establishes it very early in the film, and it's constantly referred to. I mentioned this, Chris, in respect to the quote you just pulled about when we burn Troy, we burn the world entire. And in Nolan's script, he says that because he imagines that the Trojan horse, which was sent as a gift to the Trojans by the allegedly retreating Greeks, that was the ruse, that the Greeks are going home and they left this as a gift. He writes his Odyssey film so that that was a betrayal of this principle of hospitality. It was a gift that turned out to be poison, and that all of the bad things that happened to Odysseus and to the Greeks as they return home flow from that sort of original sin. And that's why he says that, because to betray the Trojans in this dastardly, underhanded way, and we have to remember that the idea for the Trojan horse was Odysseus's.
Right.
In his moral thinking about the Odyssey, Nolan turns that into the betrayal of trust, which means that no society can hang together. That's why he fashions that quote, when we burn Troy, we burn the world entire. In other words, to say, once you have eliminated these basic principles of reciprocal trust, you cannot have a society, you can't have a world. It's an idea that Dante picked up on, in fact, in his Divine Comedy. The worst sin of all is betrayal.
It introduces the question of war crimes. I think you and I are speaking as if Odysseus accepted his guilt as a war criminal.
In Nolan's film, he does. That's the climax of the film, in a way. When he goes home, in his version, it doesn't end anything the way that, Homer's Odyssey ends. He goes off to atone for his betrayals, which included his own men. There's a big plot point that involves him having deceived one of his own men in order to effect the Trojan horse scheme. So this is very much about atonement, this film, and guilt, which, as I say, are totally foreign to Homer's way of thinking, but I think they work in the film. As I said before, if you forget about Homer and just look at the film, it's quite coherent on those points.
Yeah. To my mind, Odysseus is worrying about his men, not just worrying, deeply, deeply affected by the record. I mean, only he survived among his troops. That's a horrible burden for a military leader to carry.
One could say that Homer is very anxious about the fact that, Odysseus went off to the Trojan War with hundreds of men and dozens of ships and manages to be the only one who makes it home. Right. And it's very interesting because in the introductory section of the Odyssey, the first 10 lines, which we call the proem, which is the part where the poet announces his subject to his audience, he goes out of his way to say that, his men perished through their own foolishness, through their own heedlessness. From the very beginning of the Odyssey, Homer is very anxious about getting Odysseus off the hook, the guilt hook. And throughout the Odyssey, each of the adventures, as they are narrated, is a kind of accounting that explains how many men were lost in this adventure, how many ships were destroyed in that adventure, because Homer has to find a way to explain why this guy comes home alone when he left with hundreds of men. Now, as I always say, there's a literary reason why he has to come home alone, a narratological, let's call it, reason, which is you can't have an epic poem about 3 guys who come home from the Trojan War,
Much less 30,
you just can't do it. You've got to only focus on one guy. But it is interesting. And that guilt, which is, let's say, implicit in Homer's text, or I don't want to call it guilt because, again, it's not a Greek idea, but that problem, why is he the only one to return, is clearly on Homer's mind from the get-go. It is an issue. And you mentioned, and then I mentioned my memoir about how my dad in his 80s decided to take my Homer seminar at Bard College. And then we went on this cruise recreating the voyages of Odysseus.
I'm dying to read that book.
But I only mention it because from the first day of class, my father kept interrupting me and saying, what kind of general was this guy? He came home alone. He lost all his men. He was absolutely dumbfounded by that. He could never get over it. It's a problem. It's an issue in the Odyssey. And part of it is because Odysseus always looks out for number one.
Daniel Mendelsohn, I want your review of the Odysseus story that does not end with his homecoming. Tennyson, the Victorian poet laureate, made a great poem, in my view, and he made Odysseus an all-time hero by his other name, Ulysses, after he'd come home, deciding, no, this is boring. I'm just an old king with an aged wife and a perfectly able son who can run the kingdom. I want to gather up my troops again and sail west through the Mediterranean, beyond the sunset, through the Pillars of Hercules. It's a marvelous poem. He says, we will see, among others, the great Achilles, whom we knew. Robert Kennedy, the Robert Kennedy, made this his rallying cry after the assassination of his brother, the president. Robert Kennedy's Ulysses was speaking with nostalgia, but also with ambition renewed. He said, though much is taken, much abides, and though we are not now that strength which in old days moved earth and heaven, that which we are, one equal temper of heroic hearts, made weak by time and fate, but strong in will to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. Strong language, precisely for that daring and that courage and that will to strive, etc. Dante put Odysseus in the lowest ranks of hell because it was forbidden in those times to sail beyond Gibraltar, out of the Mediterranean, into the Atlantic, where, in fact, Odysseus and his men all die in a storm.
So what's interesting, Chris, is that the great poem that you just quoted by Tennyson actually is part of a tradition about Odysseus that starts with Dante. We meet Odysseus in the 26th canto of the Inferno, where Odysseus, or as he's now called Ulysses, is figured as an eternal wanderer, a sort of Flying Dutchman type. And it's not necessarily implicit in Homer when he really does want to get home, although we hear actually in Homer that as soon as he gets home, he has to go off again and make nice to Poseidon. But it's a beginning of a tradition about Odysseus or Ulysses that sees him as a kind of romantic hero who is motivated, as it turns out, not by a desire to get home, but by a desire to hit the road again. That what makes Ulysses interesting for later poets and writers is the idea of someone who's in love with the journey rather than, that old cliche, it's the journey, not the destination. And that becomes a kind of trope in later literature. So Tennyson picks it up in Ulysses, right? That he's home and it turns out Ithaca's a little boring. Penelope's getting old. Telemachus is nice, but maybe not the most, interesting person, a clerk, right? The people are savages, and that it turns out what he really wants to do is get back in his ship and sail in search of more adventure. Constantine Cavafy, the great Greek poet, picked up on that in his best known poem, which is called Ithaca, which gained a lot of fame when it was read at Jacqueline Onassis's funeral, since you mentioned the Kennedys. And in Ithaca, he develops the theme that it turns out it's not Ithaca, but it was the journey that gave you all the riches of life, and that you should hope that the journey, he says at one point, hope that the journey is a long one. So we have sort of, starting in the Middle Ages, refashioned Odysseus/Ulysses as a romantic character who is always yearning to keep going farther and farther and beyond, the bounds of the known world. This was an idea, I think, that was foreign to Homer, but it's certainly been the Odysseus or Ulysses that we now have inherited, I think, where he becomes a romantic yearner for more adventure, and that being home turns out not to be so interesting after all.
Daniel Mendelsohn, it's incredible. So many themes, so many connections, including the Kennedys, including the present day, including, I would say, the continuing disease of war. Is there any limit to the ways he stays relevant? Is there any curing ourselves of Odysseus and his story?
I don't think so. And I certainly hope not, because the Odyssey is about many things, one of which, as we've been, focusing on, is this business of war and violence and sort of getting past it. Another fashionable way of thinking about Odysseus right now, which Nolan very much picks up on, and this started about 20 years ago, is to see Odysseus as someone who's basically suffering from PTSD, who is having a terrible time reintegrating into peacetime society, and all the lying and all of that are just manifestations of behaviors that served him during the war but have become problematic for him in the post-war world. But there's other ways to think about Odysseus or the Odyssey beyond the war. It's a very interesting poem about identity, which is obviously a subject we talk about all the time now.
Yep.
There's a famous problem in logic. If all Cretans are liars and someone comes up to you and says, I am a Cretan, what do? Right? So Odysseus sort of embodies that. When you make your protagonist a trickster and a liar and someone who uses stories and fabrications to manipulate people, the issue of who he actually is becomes very vexed, especially because he's a master of disguise and a master of lies. The sort of basic plot line of the Odyssey, he comes home after 20 years, he's unrecognizable. So how does Penelope know it's really him? How do you know who someone is when life has changed the way they look and who they are? What does it mean to have an identity? So that's an important theme of the Odyssey, which I think goes beyond the war and violence theme, which is also very pertinent to our thinking today.
I want to note right there that I happen to remember from the Odyssey a story that Christopher Nolan leaves out, and it's one of the most touching and beautiful moments in the whole book. Odysseus has come home. He's seen Penelope again. But she mentions something about their bed, their marital bed, and do we know where it's been moved to? Well, what Odysseus knows is, and reminds her, but she's in on the story too, was that it was an immovable bed. It was built very carefully by Odysseus's own hands to be immovable. So she's bringing up a secret subject between them, and he's reminding her, but it is all about identity and recognition. It's the moment when she finally realizes, yes, he's back.
It's him.
This is my man.
Absolutely. The sort of punchline, as it were, to the Odyssey's very complicated and sophisticated investigation of identity and how do you know someone is and how do you know if they're telling the truth, is the fact that what allows this couple finally to recognize each other is not their physical appearance, because after 20 years, nobody looks the same, even if they haven't been having a terribly hard time, which both of these people have. But the fact that they know something, it's what's in them that identifies them, an interior knowledge that they share. And I think that's very moving because we've seen goddesses throwing themselves at him. They're beautiful. They're going to be beautiful forever. They're immortal. They're ageless. And all he wants to do is get back to Penelope, who is aging. At one point, the goddess Calypso, whom he rejects, says, I don't understand you. I'm a goddess. I'm going to be beautiful forever. And she's getting old. And that says something about the marriage. But also, I think that one of the ways we do identify, quote unquote, ourselves is through the relationships we have. We are relational. I very much regretted that Nolan cut basically everything emotional at the climax of the poem.
Eros disappears.
Yeah, exactly. But again, the Odyssey has much to offer beyond its very profound questions about war and violence, about identity. It has a lot to say about poetry in a very sort of meta way. There are many scenes in the Odyssey of poets like Homer himself giving performances of little epic poems, one of which is quoted in its entirety, 100 lines long. And people reacting, it's like Homer is winking at us saying, this is how you should react to good epic poetry, basically. So, it's a very sophisticated text on a lot of levels. And I think that's why it's still with it. And, I know that we had both mentioned this, this question, the ever hovering question, why do we keep coming back to this? But ultimately, because it is about the desire to go home, but also about the thrill of adventure, it is describing an essential, rather fascinating conundrum of life that we all know, which is how do you find the balance between stability and adventure, between wanting a place to belong, but also being interested in other possibilities? And the Odyssey gives you both. It shows you and twines together a great adventure story with an amazing homecoming tale. So it's got something for everybody. But I do think it speaks to something in us. We do want new things, intellectual adventures, travel, that kind of thing. But we also like the idea that there's a home waiting for us. And we all in our own lives have to figure out what the right proportion is, between those kinds of things. And I think that's another reason the Odyssey seems always to be talking to us.
Yeah, maybe he's the greatest character ever invented, Daniel Mendelsohn. But I want to close on this note from Robert Fagles, probably 25 years ago, when he published his translations of the Iliad and the Odyssey. And we made a radio program with him. But although I was teasing him a little bit, because people have been asking me, does the world really need another translation of the Iliad and the Odyssey? And he said it needs endless translations of these books because, he said, Homer, when you think about it, is really, his view, all the literature the world needs. There's enough forever for the whole globe, and he's just doing his duty. And it struck me, some people would say that about the music of Johann Sebastian Bach, too, that you don't need any much beyond that.
Gives you everything.
But the notion that, all literature is contained in Homer stuck with me. I've asked any number of people. I asked Norman Mailer. He might have said, no me, but what he said was, no Proust? Are you kidding?
It's not literally that you don't need anything else, because obviously we need Shakespeare and we need Proust, and, we probably need Norman Mailer too. But between the Iliad and the Odyssey, it covers every possibility of human experience, right? The Iliad is about mortality, confronting mortality. The Iliad is the model for all tragedy. The fact that at the end of the day, we know we're going to die no matter what we do. And then faced with the fact of our mortality, what do you do with your life? So all tragedy flows from the Iliad, and in a way, all comedy flows from the Odyssey. I don't mean comedy in the sense of ha-ha. I mean, it's an arduous tale of, you could say it's a sort of proto-rom-com in a way, these two people desperately trying to come together against all these obstacles. It ends with a kind of wedding when the husband and wife are reunited.
And don't forget, the suitors are all murdered wildly.
The settlement of the political crisis, which is that the palace has been besieged by these impious, arrogant suitors who are, by the way, violating this very important principle of hospitality by entering Odysseus's home uninvited and eating all of his wealth up. So I know it's not a popular opinion, but in the religious mentality of the archaic Greeks, Odysseus's slaughter of the suitor is a just vengeance against impiety. But to come back to my point that all of comedy flows from the Odyssey and all of tragedy flows from the Iliad. And I think that's what Bob Fagles was referring to, that it covers everything. Between the two epics, Homer basically covers every possibility for human experience. And that's why they stand as the fountainhead of our literature. It doesn't mean we don't want Proust or, anyone else for that matter, Margaret Atwood, or, I could name 100,000 authors that we like. But I think that's the idea, that he covers the full range of possibilities for our experience, both tragic and comic.
Daniel Mendelsohn, we have covered a lot of ground just in this
bit of an
hour.
odyssey ourselves.
Yeah, indeed. We've made a safe landing, and we're immensely grateful to you for sharing many levels of your own experience with this man, this book, this work. Can't thank you enough, Daniel Mendelsohn.
Thank you, Chris. It's always such a pleasure to talk with you.
Daniel Mendelsohn is for many years editor-at-large of the New York Review of Books. He's also professor of humanities at Bard College. Here at Open Source, we count on listener support. If you haven't done your part yet, please go to radioopensource.org/donate and pitch in to keep the world's first and longest-running podcast going strong. We're proud to be a founding member of Hub and Spoke, a Boston-based collective of independent voices in podcasting. Check the wide range of our interests in technology, art, history, politics at hubspokeaudio.org. You'll be glad you did, and thank you.